Buy me cowboy, I will make sure you are satisfied, said the Apache woman on sale. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sale was set up where the town stopped pretending to be orderly, past the last row of shops and near the freight yard where broken crates and warped planks were stacked without care. The ground there was uneven, packed hard by wagons and boots, and the low wooden platform looked like it had been repaired too many times to trust. Dust hung in the air without moving much, trapped by the stillness of midday, and the heat pressed down in a way that made people impatient and careless. Only a few men had gathered, not because the event mattered to them, but because it required very little effort to stay and watch. The woman stood alone on the platform, wrists tied in front of her with a rope that had been used before and would be used again. The fibers were rough, and she could feel where they rubbed against her skin when she shifted slightly to ease the pressure. She kept her feet planted wide enough to stay balanced, toes gripping the wood beneath her. She did not look at the crowd directly. Her eyes stayed forward, focused on a point just past them, because looking too closely at men who were deciding her value had already taught her nothing useful. Her breathing was steady, controlled, measured the way it had to be when panic could make things worse. She spoke once. The words were simple and deliberate, chosen for survival rather than persuasion. Her voice stayed even, not soft, not raised, carrying only as far as necessary. She did not repeat herself when no one reacted right away. She had learned that repeating made people think you were desperate, and desperation invited things she could not afford. Inside, her body was tense, her muscles tight from holding herself together, but she refused to let that show. Fear was present, but it was managed, contained, treated like a tool rather than a weakness. Elias Harper had not planned to be anywhere near the freight yard that day. He had come into town early to avoid crowds, with a clear list in his head and no interest in staying longer than required. Flour, salt, lamp oil, nails. Nothing else. He lived alone far enough outside town that every trip mattered, and he avoided unnecessary trouble because trouble had a way of staying longer than it was welcome. His past had taught him that much. He stood at the edge of the gathering, partially shaded by the side of a storage building, his hat pulled low, his hands resting at his sides. He noticed details out of habit. The condition of the rope, the way the platform sagged slightly under the woman's weight, the expressions of the men watching, bored rather than invested. What caught his attention most was not her voice, but her stillness. She was not fighting the rope, and she was not slumped beneath it either. That restraint unsettled him more than panic would have. Elias had spent years working frontier land before walking away from it, first as a hired hand, later as a man who learned how violence worked and chose to leave it behind after it took more than he was willing to lose. He had come to value quiet and predictability, building a life around routine because routine did not surprise you. Standing there now, he felt an unexpected tightening in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent enough to demand attention. He told himself it was irritation at the scene, nothing more, but he did not turn away. As the man overseeing the sale spoke again, his tone careless and impatient, Elias felt his thoughts shift from observation to consideration. He was not there to rescue anyone. He was not a man who believed in dramatic gestures or clean outcomes. He knew exactly what taking responsibility for another person could cost. He also knew what it meant to leave things as they were. His decision formed slowly, built from practical reasoning rather than impulse. He had space. He had resources. He had a cabin that no longer served a single purpose. When Elias stepped forward, the movement felt heavier than it should have. The men noticed him then, briefly assessing him before losing interest, assuming he was just another buyer. He did not negotiate. He placed the money down and waited. When the rope was cut, he did not reach for her arm or guide her step. He moved back, giving her room to adjust, watching as she recalculated what freedom meant in that moment. She stepped down on her own, her legs steady despite the tension still running through her body. She followed him not because she trusted him, but because the alternative had already proven itself. As they walked away from the platform and toward the road out of town, Elias felt the weight of his choice settle fully. This was no longer about supplies or schedules. He had altered his path, and he knew from experience that once a path changed, it rarely returned to what it had been before. They left the town through its eastern edge, not along the main road where wagons passed and eyes lingered, but along a narrower track worn flat by freight carts and men who preferred not to be noticed. The sound of the town faded quickly, replaced by wind brushing through dry grass and the soft creak of leather with each step of the horse. Elias walked ahead at first, leading by habit rather than intention, his shoulders squared, his pace steady enough to set direction without forcing it. He did not look back to check if she followed. He assumed she would, and that assumption carried a quiet weight. The woman kept several steps behind him, close enough to remain under his presence, far enough to protect herself if she needed to change course. The rope marks around her wrists had begun to redden, and she flexed her fingers slowly as they walked, testing circulation without drawing attention to it. Her eyes stayed active, scanning the land around them, measuring distance, noting the absence of cover. She had learned long ago that survival did not end when a transaction did. It only changed shape. Elias reached the horse tied beneath a weathered cottonwood, its flanks streaked with dust and sweat from standing too long in the heat. He untied it and rested a hand briefly against its neck, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of the animal before turning back toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. He took in her stance again, the way she stood ready rather than uncertain, and it reinforced something he had already decided but not yet named. He mounted without ceremony, settling into the saddle with the ease of long use, then guided the horse into a slow walk rather than urging it forward. The choice was deliberate. He was leaving room for her to adjust, to decide how close she needed to be. After a short distance, he slowed further and angled the horse toward her, extending the reins without explanation. The gesture was simple, practical, and carried no instruction beyond trust. She hesitated only long enough to assess his intent, then took them, her grip firm, her posture shifting as she assumed control. They traveled in silence, the land opening wider with every mile. The heat eased as the afternoon stretched on, and the sky seemed larger away from the town's low buildings and tangled wires. Elias watched the horizon while she guided the horse, his attention split between the path ahead and the sound of her steps. He was aware of her presence in a way he had not been aware of another person for years, not intrusive, but constant, like a change in weather you could not ignore. Inside, his thoughts stayed measured, grounded in practicality. He considered what awaited them at the cabin, the adjustments that would need to be made, the risks he had accepted by stepping forward earlier that day. He did not regret the decision, but he did not soften it either. He knew this was not charity. It was responsibility, and responsibility required follow-through. As the cabin came into view, set back against a low rise with open land stretching on all sides, the woman slowed instinctively, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the structure, the surrounding ground, the absence of fences nearby. She noted the single door, the window placement, the lack of visible neighbors. Isolation could mean safety or danger, depending on the man who owned it. Elias dismounted and secured the horse, then gestured toward the water pump with a short motion of his hand, followed by a nod toward the cabin door. Inside, the space was plain but intentional. The table stood clean. The stove held a faint warmth. Everything had a place, and nothing was decorative. Elias set down his pack, pointed once toward the shelf with food supplies, then toward the bed along the wall. He did not assign roles. He did not explain expectations. He stepped back again, physically and deliberately, and allowed the space to speak for him. The woman crossed the threshold slowly, her senses alert, taking in every detail, every sound, every absence. This was not the end of her vigilance, but it was the first place in a long time that did not immediately demand more from her. As Elias stepped outside to tend to the horse, she remained standing in the center of the room, listening to the wind move past the cabin walls, aware that something had shifted, not just in location, but in the direction of her life. Morning arrived quietly, announced only by a gradual change in light that slipped through the small window and spread across the floor in a thin, pale strip. Elias was already awake, seated at the table with his boots on, moving with the controlled economy of someone who had learned to start each day prepared rather than hopeful. He poured water into a pot and set it on the stove, listening to the faint shift of metal as it warmed, his attention steady and deliberate. The presence of another person in the cabin did not startle him, but it did alter the rhythm he had followed for years, and he adjusted without comment. The woman woke later, lifting herself from the blanket near the hearth in stages rather than all at once, testing the air, the sounds, the silence. Her body ached in ways she had learned to ignore, but she noticed immediately that nothing in the room had changed while she slept. No one had stood over her. No one had moved her belongings. That absence of interference eased a tension she had not realized she was carrying. She sat upright and watched Elias from a distance, studying how he moved, how he kept his back to her while preparing food, a choice that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. He placed a tin cup and a small plate on the table beside his own instead of across from it, leaving room without creating distance. He did not announce the meal or gesture toward it. He simply sat and began to eat. After a moment, she joined him, her movements precise, her eyes lifting briefly to assess his expression before lowering again. They ate in silence, the sound of utensils against metal marking time more clearly than words would have. Elias noticed the way she held herself straighter than necessary, as if bracing for a correction that never came. When the dishes were cleared, Elias reached for his coat and nodded toward the door. Outside, the air carried a cooler edge, and the land stretched outward in muted colors, still and waiting. He walked toward the shed without looking back, trusting that she would decide for herself whether to follow. She did, keeping a careful distance, her gaze moving from the tools stacked inside to the open space beyond. He opened the shed door fully and stepped aside, allowing her to see everything at once, nothing hidden, nothing presented as a test. He showed her how the water was drawn, how the buckets were stored, how the latch on the fence tended to stick if pulled too hard. Each instruction was brief, practical, given once. He did not correct her when she lifted the bucket differently than he would have. He watched instead, noting her strength, her balance, the way she adapted quickly to unfamiliar tasks. Inside himself, something shifted, not relief but recognition. She was not waiting to be managed. She was adjusting to survive in a new place. Later, Elias returned to the cabin alone and came back with a pair of boots, worn but solid, their leather stiff from disuse rather than neglect. He set them down near the step without comment and went back to his work. She noticed them immediately, but did not touch them until he had moved out of sight. When she finally sat to try them on, she worked her feet into them slowly, tightening the laces herself, standing to test her weight before taking a single step. The ground felt different beneath her then, more certain, less exposed. As the day wore on, they settled into parallel movement rather than shared task, each aware of the other without interference. Elias split wood while she swept the cabin floor, their paths crossing only briefly. When he paused to rest his shoulder, she slowed her movements without being asked, adjusting the pace of the space they shared. He noticed and said nothing, but the awareness stayed with him, quiet and persistent. By late afternoon, the light shifted again, and the cabin held the day's warmth. Elias stood at the doorway for a moment, looking out across the land that had once felt empty and now felt altered, though he could not yet define how. Inside, she folded the blanket she had slept on and placed it neatly near the hearth, not because she had been told to, but because she intended to remain. Neither spoke of plans or permission, but the choices they made throughout the day settled into the space between them, steady and unmistakable. The fourth day began with a low wind moving across the open ground, steady but not harsh, the kind that carried sound farther than expected. Elias noticed it immediately when he stepped outside, adjusting his coat before the chill had time to settle into his joints. He stood still for a moment, listening, not because he expected trouble, but because listening had become a habit that once kept him alive. The land answered with nothing more than distance and motion, and he accepted that answer without disappointment. Inside the cabin, Naeli was already awake. She had risen before the light fully reached the window, not out of urgency, but because her body no longer trusted stillness after dawn. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the space, though she was beginning to understand that silence here did not carry the same risks it once had. She poured water into the basin and washed her face, watching herself briefly in the dull reflection, noting the steadiness in her eyes that had not been there days ago. The marks on her wrists had faded to pale lines, reminders rather than injuries, and she flexed her hands again, not out of pain but habit. Elias returned and set a bundle of fence wire on the table. He said only one word, "North," then stepped back outside. Naeli followed after a pause, pulling on the boots he had left for her days earlier, the leather now softening with use. She understood enough to know what he meant without further explanation. The fence along the northern edge had been weakened by winter runoff, and it was work that needed attention before it became a problem. He did not ask her to come. He did not tell her to stay. The choice remained hers, and that freedom carried a weight she was still learning how to hold. They walked together, but did not speak. The distance between them was smaller now, not because either had closed it deliberately, but because their steps had gradually aligned. Elias carried the tools while Naeli handled the wire, her fingers steady as she unwound it, measuring length by sight and instinct rather than counting. She watched how Elias tested each post before working on it, checking for weakness at the base, pushing once, then again, his movements patient and exact. There was no rush in him, no frustration when a task took longer than expected. That restraint caught her attention more than any display of strength would have. As they worked, Naeli became aware of how her body responded to the routine. The tension she had carried since the sail began to loosen, replaced by a focused alertness that felt different from fear. She noticed that Elias never positioned himself behind her without warning. When he needed to pass close, he paused until she shifted first. These were not gestures meant to be noticed, but they were deliberate, and she cataloged them quietly, building a picture of who he was through action rather than assumption. Elias, for his part, found his thoughts drifting more than usual. He caught himself watching the way Naeli handled the wire, how she adjusted when it snagged, how she did not curse or hesitate, only recalculated and continued. He had lived alone long enough to forget what shared labor felt like, the subtle coordination that developed without instruction. It unsettled him slightly, not because it was unpleasant, but because it reminded him of something he had decided to leave behind. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the post in front of him, driving it deeper into the ground with measured force. By midday, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of distant heat and dry grass. They paused without discussion, sitting a short distance apart, sharing water from the same canteen without ceremony. Naeli drank first, then handed it back, watching Elias closely as he took it without hesitation. That small act settled something in her chest she had not realized was still unsettled. Trust, she understood, was not built through reassurance, but through moments that passed without harm. On the walk back, Elias spoke again, this time more than a single word. He told her where the storm runoff usually cut through the land, where the ground softened dangerously after heavy rain, and which direction the nearest town lay, if she ever needed it. His voice was calm, factual, carrying no warning or implication. Naeli listened carefully, committing the information to memory, aware that knowledge here meant independence, not control. Back at the cabin, Elias took a piece of wood from the stack and began shaping it with his knife. He worked slowly, shaving it down into a narrow plank, smoothing the edges with care. Naeli watched for a moment before returning inside to prepare food. She noticed how naturally the space divided between them now, how neither felt the need to account for the other's movements. When Elias brought the finished plank inside and fixed it to the wall beside the bed, creating a small shelf, he did not explain its purpose. Naeli understood immediately. She placed her few belongings there later that evening, arranging them with quiet precision. As night settled in, the cabin held warmth and sound differently than it had before. Elias sat at the table, mending a tear in his coat, while Naeli cleaned the cooking pot, setting it back where it belonged. The work was simple, unremarkable, but the rhythm of it carried a sense of permanence neither had expected to feel so soon. Elias glanced toward the shelf once, noting how it had already been claimed, and the sight grounded him more than he anticipated. When they finally settled for the night, the space between them felt intentional rather than cautious. The wind continued outside, brushing against the cabin walls, but inside, everything remained steady. Neither spoke of the future, and neither needed to. The day had introduced a truth that did not require words, that whatever had brought them together was no longer the only thing holding them there. The warning came without sound first, only a change in the way the air behaved, a heaviness that pressed closer to the cabin than it had the day before. Elias felt it as soon as he stepped outside after breakfast, the quiet too arranged, the land holding itself in a way that suggested interruption rather than peace. He paused near the woodpile, not moving, letting his eyes travel across the slope, the fence line, the shallow dip where water gathered after rain. Nothing was visibly wrong, yet his body responded as if it recognized a pattern it had learned years ago and never forgotten. Inside, Naeli was rinsing the basin when she noticed the delay. She did not call out. Instead, she dried her hands slowly and moved toward the doorway, stopping just short of stepping outside. From there, she watched Elias stand still, his posture straight, his weight settled evenly, a stance that was not relaxed but controlled. She had seen men prepare for violence before, often loudly, often with anger. This was different. There was no performance in him, no tightening meant to intimidate. He was simply ready. The sound of hoofbeats reached them moments later, not hurried, not cautious, the rhythm of men who assumed they would not be challenged. Two riders came into view from the low trail that cut across the eastern ridge, their horses already lathered from distance. Elias counted them automatically and adjusted his position so that the cabin door remained at his back. He did not look toward Naeli, but he was aware of her presence, of where she stood, of the fact that she had not retreated inside. That knowledge mattered more than he expected. The riders slowed near the fence, not dismounting, their eyes scanning the cabin and the land around it. One of them spoke first, his voice carrying easily, practiced at being heard without effort. He asked about a woman. He described her poorly, but the intent behind the words was clear enough. Elias answered without raising his voice, stating only that no one from town had business there. He did not offer details. He did not explain himself. The response was complete in its restraint. Naeli listened from the doorway, her body still, her attention sharp. She understood immediately that the men were not asking out of concern or curiosity. Their tone held expectation, the assumption that answers would be provided because they were demanded. Her chest tightened, not with panic, but with the familiar calculation of risk. She assessed Elias again, not as the man who had brought her there, but as the man who now stood between her and what she had already endured. She did not know yet whether he would hold that line. The second rider shifted in his saddle and leaned forward slightly, pressing the conversation where the first had left off. He mentioned town authority. He implied obligation. Elias let the words settle without interruption, then replied with fewer words than before. He stated that anyone crossing his fence without permission would be turned away. There was no threat in his voice, but there was finality. The land, the cabin, the space behind him were his responsibility, and he treated them as such. The riders exchanged a look, irritation passing between them quickly. They were used to compliance or fear, and Elias offered neither. One of them glanced past him toward the doorway, catching sight of Naeli for the first time. She met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable, her posture unyielding. She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. The moment stretched long enough for Elias to notice the shift in the rider's focus and adjust his stance by a fraction, enough to block the view without making a show of it. That adjustment settled something in Naeli. It was not relief exactly, but recognition. Elias was not reacting to her presence as a problem to be managed. He was responding to the intrusion as a boundary violation, and she happened to be on the right side of that boundary. The distinction mattered more to her than safety alone ever had. The riders pressed once more, their tone sharpening, impatience surfacing as their assumption of control faltered. Elias did not engage with the change. He repeated himself, word for word, without inflection, without escalation. The repetition was deliberate, a signal that the conversation had ended. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the restless shift of the horse's hooves against the dirt. Eventually, the riders turned away, not because they were convinced, but because there was nothing more to extract. They did not issue threats or promises. They simply left, the sound of hoofbeats receding slowly, carrying frustration with them. Elias remained where he was until the land settled back into its usual stillness. Only then did he move, stepping aside from the doorway to allow Nayeli space again. Neither of them spoke immediately. Nayeli exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly she had been holding her breath. Elias closed the door behind them, securing it with a calm motion that suggested routine rather than alarm. He walked to the table and poured water into 2 cups, setting one near her without looking at her face. The gesture was simple, but it acknowledged the shared weight of what had just passed. Nayeli took the cup and drank, her hand steady. She studied Elias openly now, noting the absence of triumph or tension in him. He did not act as though he had proven anything. He simply resumed his place in the space, as if standing firm had been no more remarkable than repairing a fence. That lack of performance made the moment feel real in a way words never could. Later that afternoon, Elias walked the perimeter alone, checking the fence line and the low trail, reinforcing what needed reinforcing. Nayeli remained near the cabin, not because she was told to, but because she chose to. She prepared food, set things in order, and waited. When he returned, dusty and quiet, she handed him a clean cloth for his hands without explanation. He accepted it with a nod, and that small exchange carried more meaning than any assurance either of them could have offered. As evening settled, the cabin felt different, not because danger had come close, but because it had been answered. Nayeli understood now that staying here did not mean hiding. It meant being claimed by the space itself, protected by a man who did not announce his choices, but stood by them fully once made. Elias, sitting across from her at the table, recognized that his life had shifted again, not through loss this time, but through commitment, and he accepted that weight with the same steadiness that had guided him all along. The morning after the riders left did not arrive gently. The sky stayed low and pale, the kind that pressed down without rain, and the air carried a dry tension that made even familiar sounds feel exposed. Elias woke before first light, not out of habit this time, but because sleep had loosened its hold too early. He sat at the edge of the bed for a long moment, boots still off, elbows resting on his knees, replaying the measured tone of his own voice from the day before, checking it for cracks he had not allowed to surface. He found none, which did not ease him as much as he expected. Nayeli stirred near the hearth, sensing movement before sound. She rose quietly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders before standing, careful not to step too close. The space between them no longer felt fragile, but it still carried respect. She watched Elias pull on his boots, noting the slower pace in his hands, the way he tightened the laces as if grounding himself through the motion. When he stood, he did not reach for his coat right away. Instead, he looked toward the door, considering the land beyond it as if weighing more than distance. They worked separately that morning, not out of distance but focus. Elias walked the boundary again, this time extending his inspection farther than usual, following the trail the riders had taken and marking where the earth had been disturbed. He knelt once, brushing dirt aside with his fingers, confirming what he already suspected. They had come to test him, not to claim. That distinction mattered. It meant they would return eventually, and when they did, they would expect a different outcome. He stood and made a decision that did not feel dramatic, but necessary. Back at the cabin, Naeli reorganized the interior with care rather than urgency. She shifted the table closer to the window to catch more light, stacked firewood nearer to the stove, and adjusted the shelf Elias had built so it held weight more evenly. Each change was small, practical, and intentional. She was not decorating. She was preparing. The act steadied her thoughts, giving shape to a sense of permanence that had not yet been spoken aloud. When Elias returned, dust on his boots and a different set to his shoulders, he noticed every adjustment without commenting on any of them. They ate later than usual, seated closer than before, not because the space demanded it, but because neither felt the need to keep distance. Elias spoke first, his voice low, even carrying no preface. He told her the truth of why he lived where he did, not in fragments, not softened. He had lost people to a dispute that turned violent faster than reason could catch it. He had walked away not because he was afraid, but because he no longer trusted what the frontier rewarded. Isolation had not been a punishment. It had been a solution. Naeli listened without interruption, her eyes steady on his hands as he spoke, reading tension there more than in his face. When he finished, she did not rush to fill the silence. She let it exist, acknowledging what had been offered. Then she told him what had been taken from her, not in detail, but in outcome. Her people scattered, her name traded between strangers. The years spent learning which parts of herself to hide to survive. She spoke plainly, without anger, without appeal. This was not a confession. It was context. Something settled between them then, not comfort, but clarity. Elias understood that what he had offered her so far was not rescue, and what she had accepted was not dependence. They were both standing where they were because they chose to, and choice carried responsibility on both sides. He told her what he planned to do next, not as a command, but as information. He would reinforce the outer fence, extend the line farther into the draw, and make it clear the land was watched. He would not involve the town unless forced. He would not move her unless she asked. Naeli absorbed the plan and responded with one of her own. She would learn the land as thoroughly as he had. She wanted to know where the water shifted during storms, where the ground softened, where sound traveled at night. Elias nodded once, accepting the request without surprise. He handed her a small knife later that afternoon, setting it on the table between them rather than placing it in her hand. The blade was clean, well-balanced, practical. The gesture was not symbolic. It was preparation. As the day wore on, clouds gathered without committing to rain. The light dimmed early, and the wind returned, stronger this time, rattling the cabin walls with insistence. Elias secured the shutters while Naeli tended the fire, adjusting it until the heat stayed even. When a sudden gust forced the door inward before the latch caught, Naeli reacted without freezing, stepping aside rather than back, allowing Elias to close it cleanly. The movement told him more than words ever could. She was no longer bracing for impact. She was responding to environment. Night settled heavy and close. The cabin felt smaller, not confining, but concentrated, every sound amplified by weather and proximity. Elias remained awake longer than usual, seated at the table with his rifle resting nearby, not because he expected an attack, but because vigilance felt appropriate. Naeli sat across from him, mending a tear in her dress with thread she had found among his supplies. She worked carefully, her fingers steady, her focus absolute. At some point, Elias realized he was watching her rather than the door. When the storm finally passed without incident, leaving only wind and distance behind, Elias stood and extinguished the lamp. He did not issue instructions for sleep. He did not retreat into himself. He simply said her name once, confirming her presence. She answered with his, and the exchange felt grounding, mutual. They settled for the night with less space between them than before, not touching, but aligned, their breathing falling into an easy rhythm that spoke of shared ground rather than guarded truce. As darkness deepened, Elias acknowledged something he had resisted naming. His life was no longer organized around avoidance. It was being shaped by inclusion, deliberate and chosen. Naeli, eyes open in the dim, recognized that staying here no longer felt like waiting. It felt like building one quiet decision at a time. The decision to go back toward town did not come suddenly. It formed over several days, shaped by small observations rather than urgency. Elias noticed how supplies diminished faster now that two people shared the cabin, how the last sack of flour sat lighter against the wall, how lamp oil burned longer into the evenings because the nights no longer passed in complete silence. He measured these changes carefully, not as burdens, but as facts that required planning. On the fourth morning after the storm, he said they would ride out together, and the statement carried no question in it. Nayeli did not react right away. She finished tying the bundle of dried meat she had prepared, set it into Elias's pack, and only then looked at him. Her expression held focus rather than concern. Towns had never been neutral places for her. They were unpredictable, crowded with memory, shaped by other people's authority. Still, she nodded once. Avoidance had never saved her before. Preparation had. They left early, before the sun rose fully, the sky still muted and colorless. Elias saddled the horse while Nayeli checked the straps without being asked, tightening one that had loosened overnight. They rode close together, not touching but aligned, their pace matched. The land shifted slowly as they traveled, the open ground narrowing, paths becoming more defined. Elias felt the weight of familiarity return with each mile. He had spent years distancing himself from places like the one they were heading toward, yet now he found his attention fixed not on what awaited him, but on how Nayeli carried herself beside him. She sat upright in the saddle, her movements controlled, her gaze steady. She did not hide, but neither did she invite attention. Elias recognized the posture immediately. It was the stance of someone who refused to disappear without offering themselves up for scrutiny. That balance impressed him more than confidence ever could. It also reinforced the choice he was about to make. The town came into view gradually, buildings low and uneven, smoke rising thinly from chimneys. Elias slowed the horse before reaching the main road and adjusted their path so they entered from the side rather than the center. People noticed them anyway. Eyes followed them with interest that turned to confusion when Elias dismounted first and then helped Nayeli down without hesitation. He did not keep a hand on her arm. He did not guide her steps. He simply stood beside her, close enough that the intention was unmistakable. They moved through the street together. Elias collected what he needed efficiently, speaking only when required, his tone calm, his presence steady. Nayeli stayed near, her awareness sharp, tracking movement, listening for shifts in tone. When a shopkeeper glanced at her too long, Elias placed himself between them without comment, continuing the transaction as if nothing had happened. The act was quiet, but it carried weight. Nayeli noticed the lack of performance in it, the absence of threat or display. He was not asserting ownership. He was setting a boundary. The moment came when they encountered someone Elias recognized, a man who had been present at the sale days earlier. The recognition was mutual, surprise flickering across the man's face before calculation replaced it. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elias did not wait for the words. He addressed Nayeli directly, introducing her by name, then stated clearly that she was his wife. The statement landed without emphasis, without challenge. It was not meant to convince. It was meant to inform. Nayeli felt the shift immediately. The word did not bind her in the way she once would have expected. It steadied her instead. Elias had not asked permission in front of others, but he had already given her choice in every way that mattered. She accepted the declaration by remaining where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence firm. The man said nothing further. He nodded once and stepped aside, the conversation ending before it began. They did not linger after that. Elias finished their business and guided Nayeli back toward the edge of town. Only once they had cleared the last building and the land opened again did he speak. He told her that if she did not want the name, he would not use it again. He said it plainly, without apology or defense. Nayeli listened and then responded just as directly. She told him that names mattered less than actions, and that it had already been earned. The exchange felt complete in a way neither questioned. On the ride back, the air felt lighter. The land seemed to stretch more easily beneath them. Elias became aware of how naturally his thoughts now included another person, not as an obligation, but as a constant. He found that he did not resist the awareness. Nayeli, for her part, noticed how the tension she carried into town had not returned with her. Something had been settled there, not through confrontation, but through clarity. Back at the cabin, Elias unpacked supplies while Nayeli put things away without instruction, their movements overlapping smoothly. Elias retrieved a small bundle wrapped in cloth from his pack and set on the table. Inside was a simple ring, plain and sturdy, made by a local smith he trusted. He had purchased it without ceremony, not as a symbol meant to impress, but as something that would last. He did not kneel. He did not speak at length. He placed it between them and waited. Nayeli picked it up, turning it once in her fingers, feeling its weight. She did not rush the decision. She thought of the cabin, the land, the way Elias stood in the doorway when it mattered. She slid the ring onto her hand herself. The action was deliberate, unambiguous. Elias watched without speaking, the acceptance settling into him with a sense of rightness he had not expected to feel again. As evening fell, they prepared the meal together, standing closer now, exchanging brief words about small things. The cabin held them easily, the walls no longer echoing. Outside, the wind moved across the grass as it always had, indifferent to change. Inside, two lives had aligned through choice rather than necessity, and the quiet that followed was not empty. It was shared, solid, and fully claimed. The days that followed the return from town did not announce themselves as different, yet everything moved with a steadier rhythm that neither of them had known before. The cabin no longer felt like a place borrowed from solitude. It had shifted into something occupied with intention, shaped by two presences that understood each other without needing alignment spoken out loud. Elias noticed it first in the mornings, in the way he no longer paused before stepping outside, in how the silence around the cabin no longer pressed inward but settled calmly, as if it knew it belonged. Nayeli adapted to the land with increasing precision. She learned the patterns of light as it crossed the clearing, how shadows reached farther in late afternoon, how sound traveled differently depending on wind direction. Elias did not instruct her. He answered when she asked, which was not often, and when he did, his answers were complete, never held back. She absorbed the information quickly, mapping the terrain in her mind until it became familiar enough to trust. That familiarity brought a new kind of confidence, quieter than defiance, stronger than hope. Work filled their days, not as a distraction, but as structure. Elias extended the fence line beyond the shallow draw, setting posts deeper than before, anchoring them against erosion. Nayeli assisted without hovering, passing tools when needed, learning the tension of wire by feel rather than measurement. She discovered that Elias worked best without interruption, but welcomed presence, and she adjusted accordingly. He, in turn, learned her pace, recognizing when to slow his own movements so their tasks aligned naturally. Inside the cabin, the changes were subtle but cumulative. Nayeli reorganized storage so heavier items rested lower, balancing the shelves more efficiently. Elias repaired a crack in the wall near the stove, sealing it against future weather. Neither announced these actions. They simply did what needed to be done, trusting the other to notice or not. The space responded by holding warmth longer, by remaining orderly without effort. It felt lived in, not crowded. At night, they spent more time at the table than apart. Elias cleaned his rifle methodically, not because he expected use, but because maintenance mattered. Nayeli mended clothing, her hands steady, her focus absolute. They spoke occasionally, never filling the quiet unnecessarily. When Elias mentioned plans for the coming months, they were no longer framed around survival alone. He spoke of planting, of reinforcing the roof before winter, of expanding the small corral. Nayeli listened and added her own thoughts, practical and grounded. She suggested where water collected after storms, where planting would hold best. Elias accepted her input without hesitation, and the shared planning shifted something fundamental. This was no longer a place one of them might leave. One afternoon, while Elias worked near the far fence, Naeli walked the perimeter alone, not to escape, not to test limits, but to claim understanding. She moved deliberately, noting where the ground dipped, where grass grew thinner, where tracks crossed and faded. She practiced listening, separating distant sounds from those close enough to matter. When she returned to the cabin, Elias looked up from his work and read the change in her posture immediately. She had walked the land as someone who belonged to it, not as a guest. That evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the clearing, Elias brought out a length of timber he had been setting aside. He worked on it slowly, shaping it into a narrow frame. Naeli watched from the doorway, recognizing the intention before the form was complete. It was not elaborate. It was functional, designed to sit above the door. When he finished, he mounted it securely, carving their shared name into the wood with steady care. The act was quiet, final, and done without ceremony. Naeli stood beside him as he worked, her presence enough. The following days deepened that sense of permanence. Elias stopped scanning the horizon as often, his vigilance shifting from constant watchfulness to awareness that responded when needed. Naeli found herself moving freely within the space, no longer measuring every sound, no longer bracing for interruption. The cabin became a place where her body could rest without remaining alert, a change she recognized only when she realized she had slept through the night without waking once. One morning, Elias returned from checking the outer boundary with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He sat on the table and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a pair of boots newly repaired, reinforced at the sole, fitted specifically for Naeli's stride. He had taken them to a smith during their last trip without telling her, not as a surprise, but because the timing felt right. Naeli touched the leather, testing its strength, understanding the effort behind the choice. She wore them that day, walking the land with a steadiness that felt earned. They spoke of the future more openly now, not in abstract terms, but in sequence. Elias discussed what winter would demand, what could be stored, what would need reinforcing. Naeli asked questions that reflected commitment rather than caution. She spoke of what staying meant to her, not as obligation, but as decision. Elias listened without interruption, absorbing her words fully. He did not respond immediately. When he did, it was to confirm what had already been demonstrated. He told her she was home. The statement carried no condition. As the season edged closer to change, the land responded with cooler nights and sharper mornings. Elias adjusted the cabin accordingly, sealing gaps, stacking additional firewood. Naeli prepared dried food and organized supplies with foresight. Their movements overlapped with ease, each anticipating the other's needs without assumption. They had learned how to share space without intrusion, how to support without control. One evening, after a long day, they sat together outside, the air calm, the horizon wide and unthreatening. Elias rested his arm along the back of the bench, close enough that Naeli could lean if she chose. She did, settling into the space naturally. The contact was unremarkable in the best way, grounded, steady. Elias did not stiffen or pull away. He remained still, allowing the moment to exist without interpretation. As darkness settled, Naeli realized something quietly significant. She was no longer measuring time in days survived, but in work completed, plans made, moments shared. Elias, feeling the weight of her against him, acknowledged that his solitude had transformed into partnership without conflict or loss. The cabin behind them held the proof of what they had built together, not through declaration, but through consistent choice. When they stood to go inside, Elias reached for Naeli's hand without thinking. She took it without pause. The action did not feel new or uncertain. It felt like the natural conclusion of everything that had come before, and the beginning of what would continue, steady and unbroken. The first snow arrived earlier than expected, not as a storm, but as a quiet decision made overnight. Elias noticed it before opening the door, the way the light reflected differently through the window, softer, more even, as if the world had been covered carefully rather than buried. When he stepped outside, the ground held a thin, clean layer that muted sound and erased old tracks without hiding the shape of the land beneath. The cabin stood firm against it, unchanged, solid, exactly as it should be. Nayeli joined him moments later, pulling her coat tighter as she took in the view. She did not react with surprise or unease. Instead, she studied the snow the way she studied everything now, assessing what it meant for movement, for work, for the day ahead. She noted where it had gathered deeper along the fence line and where the wind had left the earth bare. Winter was not a threat to her anymore. It was a condition to prepare for, and preparation was something she understood. They moved through the morning without discussion, each attending to tasks already agreed upon through weeks of shared routine. Elias reinforced the last section of the corral, driving posts into ground that had begun to stiffen with cold. Nayeli stacked firewood inside the shed, arranging it so the oldest would be used first, the newer kept dry and ready. Their work intersected naturally, tools exchanged without pause, space shared without friction. The land responded by offering no resistance, as if recognizing the steadiness of their presence. By midday, the cabin held warmth easily. The stove worked efficiently, the repaired walls kept out the cold, and the table bore the marks of two lives lived in alignment rather than collision. They ate together, unhurried, discussing the order of the coming weeks. Elias spoke of supply runs and livestock. Nayeli spoke of storing grain and reinforcing the roof before heavier snow fell. The conversation did not circle uncertainty or fear. It addressed continuity. After the meal, Elias retrieved a folded paper from a chest beneath the bed. He placed it on the table between them and flattened it carefully. It was a simple document prepared during their last visit to town, bearing the marks of official recognition. Nayeli recognized it immediately, not because she had seen it before, but because she understood what it represented. Elias told her he had finalized it without spectacle, making their union legally binding in a way the town would respect and leave alone. He had done it not to claim her, but to protect the life they were building from interference. Nayeli read it slowly, absorbing every word. She felt no tightening in her chest, no sense of being trapped or renamed against her will. Instead, she felt a calm certainty settle deeper than anything she had known before. This was not the loss of identity. It was the confirmation of choice. She signed it herself, her hand steady, her name clear. Elias watched without comment, understanding that the act mattered because it was hers. The afternoon passed with quiet efficiency. They checked the roof together, securing loose shingles. Elias worked above, while Nayeli held the ladder steady below, her stance firm, her attention unwavering. The cooperation felt ordinary, and that ordinariness carried more weight than ceremony ever could. When the last task was finished, they stood together in the clearing, the land spread wide and clean before them, the cabin behind them complete. As evening approached, Elias prepared a meal that took longer than usual, using ingredients he had saved deliberately. Nayeli set the table with care, not as a gesture, but as acknowledgement. They ate by lamplight, the glow warm against the encroaching dark, speaking occasionally, never out of obligation. When a meal was finished, Elias cleared the table while Nayeli poured water and wiped the surface clean. Their movements overlapped with the ease of long familiarity. Later, Elias stepped outside one final time to secure the door and check the perimeter. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear, stars sharp and distant. He stood there longer than necessary, not watching for danger, but taking in the stillness, aware that his life no longer felt suspended between what had been lost and what might go wrong next. It felt present, grounded and sufficient. Inside, Nayeli laid out blankets near the hearth, adjusting them so they would share the same warmth without crowding. When Elias returned, she looked up, meeting his eyes fully. There was no hesitation there, no question left unanswered. They moved closer, the distance between them closing naturally, their contact deliberate and calm. Elias rested his hand against hers, not gripping, not guiding, simply present. Nayeli leaned into him, her weight balanced, her trust unguarded. They sat together as the fire burned lower, the cabin holding the sound of their breathing and the faint crackle of wood. Elias spoke once, quietly, stating that this place, this life, was permanent for him. He did not frame it as promise or vow. It was a fact he had chosen and would continue to choose. Nayeli answered with equal clarity, telling him she was no longer passing through anything. She was staying. When they finally laid down to sleep, it was not as two people sharing space out of necessity, but as partners settled into a life they had constructed carefully, without force, without illusion. Outside, the land rested under snow, unchanged and vast. Inside, the cabin held a future that was neither uncertain nor fragile. Morning would come, and with it work, seasons, years. The past would remain part of them, but it no longer directed them. Elias and Nayeli had built something durable, rooted in decision and sustained by daily action. There were no loose ends, no unfinished questions, only a shared life moving forward, steady and complete.